Hey guys, Brent Hull here. Happy Wednesday, design video day, Victorian, okay? So how do you do a good Victorian today? It really comes down to all those individual parts and pieces. You're gonna see that it's getting the windows right, getting the doors right, and getting the porch right. If you can get those few things right, along with elevating some ornamentation, you really can get a pretty good looking Victorian today, at least one that's authentic. So come check out this video, Victorian Wednesday. Come join me. Okay guys, so kind of the Neo-Victorian, they are hard to reproduce because there's originally so much detail and so many different elements as part of the decoration that was going along the Victorian movement when they had new materials, new access to machines that allowed much faster reproduction, and you have ornamentation almost everywhere on these buildings. So there are a few definitive details on a Victorian house, and if we dial into all these details, right, the 4/4 window really wasn't a popular window then. It would have been a 2/2 or a 1/1. Also, the proportion of the window was long and thin, and so it would look much more like that than the 4/4. And notice too that my glass panes are starting to turn sideways, right, which is kind of that modern deal I've talked about in other videos, and that the pane of the window needs to be kind of vertical, it kind of lifting up, because what this house needs is visible height. And what you're going to see in the Victorian era is elongation and height. And so when the window is like this 2/2, it becomes very tall. The other thing that always happened around Victorian windows is they ended up having all these crazy hoods, whether they're pedimented or whatever else, but a hood on a Victorian window was very common. There's going to be a lot more trim around the window. So all of a sudden, not only does the window get tall and thin, but it gets elaborated, it gets ornamented and detailed. So windows is one thing, right? This window actually needs to be much more like this, right? And so, that's a more appropriate window for this house instead of this boxy window like this. All the other details, if I just, singled out that door and you didn't see anything else, where would that go? It doesn't really go on a Victorian house. It could go on any kind of new house today. So when we pick the individual parts, dialing down to these individual elements is really important. Probably the biggest failure on this house is this stonework, because they've introduced stone, into a porte-cochere, and it looks like the Rock Man from the Fantastic Four, right? It's all rock, and it doesn't make sense. Like you would never put rock up in here into this eave, right? You'd never do these arches the way, and there's just this field of rock work up here. It looks out of place, right? There really isn't a precedent of putting rock work on a house like this. So how I fixed this house is, there are some things that are appropriate, like this detail here, where you had this corner overhang and this kind of cut back. That's actually a really good Victorian detail with what was often bracketed on the outside. But I'm going to take all the windows, I'm going to make them longer, I'm going to make them 2/2. I'm going to put window headers over top, and I'm not going to have any areas where I have this blocky stucco stuff. I'm going to go with siding, fishtail, dog ear, fence post siding, all these different kinds of sidings that were available here that would make this more interesting. So what basically I did was I didn't change really any of the roof line or anything else. I did make this kind of turret much taller, so if you flip back, that one's kind of short and this one's much taller. I've kind of organized the corners, I've added siding in here, and I've put a little pediment top over top here, lengthen that top, right? So now something that's kind of plain, right, and boxy, all of a sudden has this visual height. I've taken this window, and there's kind of a typical window detail that another Victorian window would have what's called a Queen Anne sash. And Queen Anne sash is that this upper sash is decorative and the lower sash is left empty like a single light. And you'll sometimes see these things with these little squares of light that go around the outside that are oftentimes with colored glass, and then no lights below. So that's what I put in here, in this space up here, is that colored light. I've decorated the eave up here. And then on this element here, you see that I've designed a little panel below the window. I've elongated the window. I've given it its own pediment. I've kept that same roof detail. I've just added ornamentation. The biggest thing I did was change that porch. Now, I don't love the way this porte-cochere goes out and the way this is designed, but it's much more typical that this would be a roof going all the way across and incorporate this porte-cochere into this porch detail. And look what I've done with the porch, right? I've taken kind of standard balustrades. You kind of see the old line for the porch rail here. I've lowered it because, as I've said in a bunch of my other videos, you know, the porch rail is never 36 on these houses because of the height of the pedestal. To be much lower. So there isn't really a precedent for doing rock pedestals on a thing. It would have been a much more, probably a whole turned column, different kind of porch work. Notice I've done this little porch work above here. I'm just taking typical, you know, Victorian details and taking out the ones that are kind of new house and putting in Victorian ones, and it transforms this house. The door too was oftentimes a double door, okay? Not a single door with side lights. That's kind of a colonial revival kind of thing. This kind of door is much more typical. If you'll notice, basically I've taken all the parts and pieces. I've taken this door, I've changed it. I've taken the windows and changed it. I've taken the porch details and changed it. Still kept the same form and everything else, just gone back with Victorian elements so that we end up with a house that is, you know, a little more interesting, a little more appropriate. And, you know, there is my, you know, effort at kind of fixing this house, taking the same design details, just changing them out. So authenticity is really important here. Authenticity of you say, well, what? Well, windows, doors, porches, just essentially fix those things and then add a little more ornamentation typical of that period, and it helped this house quite a bit. Okay guys, what'd you think? Helped that Victorian a little bit. You know, some of those details were just pulled from the wrong design book, right? They were pulled from the colonial revival or pulled from kind of a new house. And so materiality is really important, getting the materials right. But certainly just doors, windows, and porch really helped change that thing dramatically, at least I thought. Let me know what you think. I'm Brent Hull. Thanks for watching.